Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Eliza Parrish. I'm the Director of Alumni Relations for the Mason School of Business at the College of William & Mary. And as many of you know, these webinars are brought to you as part of our promise to provide you with opportunities for lifelong learning. Today, I am enormously excited to bring you one of your fellow alumni, Dan Weber. I've seen him speak. He presented to the online MBA students during their required residency program, and he was fantastic. Today's webinar, Reputational Risk in a Digital Age, the New Realities in Crisis Communications Management, should be fascinating to all of you. A brief introduction. Dan, who is class of '02, joined Edelman in the summer of 2004. As Executive Vice President on the digital team in Washington, D.C., he serves as Director Operations for an 80-person plus staff. He provides companies and organizations strategic counsel specific to corporate reputation matters and crisis-related issues that includes leading Edelman's D.C. digital corporate, crisis, and financial centers of excellence. You have been sent more information on Dan's background, which I will allow you to read on your own so we don't take any more time away from this presentation. And with that, I give you to Dan Weber.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Eliza, and thank you to the Mason School. It's really exciting to be here and virtually connected to each of you. This is a topic that I've spent the last 13 years of my career working on, and very excited to bring some thoughts to you today in the next hour. It's interesting as you're looking at the polling right now that it's been a busy year. There's been a lot of stuff going on in the world of crisis or risk, particularly interesting for the automotive industry, just even in the last 48 hours with the issue regarding the Star Trek celebrity and Jeep. You can see here it looks like Volkswagen and the Takata airbag recall are getting many of your votes. And I'm sure if we left it open, you could probably fill this with 20 other different topics. But this is where I spend a good deal of my time. And actually, if you could go to the slide here, okay, very good. I'll go ahead and start into this. So thank you for the introduction. I've been at Edelman for about 13 years, and Edelman is a communications marketing firm. And within Edelman, we have about 5,500 employees around the world, 65 different offices. And one of the specialty groups that we have within the company is around crisis and risk. And we have about 180 dedicated crisis and risk folks around the world, ready to parachute in for any issues. We spend a good chunk of our time actually doing rapid response for many different companies and organizations around the world. But we also spend a lot of time helping companies and organizations prepare and think about risk. And it's a really dynamic area. And one of the things I was thinking about as I was preparing for today was, what does crisis management mean for folks who may not actually have to manage crisis as part of their jobs? And I suspect many of you out there aren't officially tasked with crisis or risk management. But the way we think about it at Edelman is kind of in two different bubbles. One is a promote bubble, which many of us are tasked with every day, promoting a new product, promoting a service, holding an event. And then the other side of things are protect. So how do we go about thinking about protecting the enterprise from risk and navigating risk when it pops up? And you really can't have one without the other, in my opinion. If you're going to spend millions of dollars on a product announcement or some kind of rollout of a new service, you better spend a little bit of time and energy thinking about how do you protect against risk. And that's really where you come in, because when I often get the question about, well, who is responsible for managing risk, who's responsible for reputation, a lot of people will look at the CEO or principal or president, but I would say we should look at everybody around the table. It's everybody's responsibility to think about risk and to think about reputation. So it looks like we already got our first question. Do they work with NGOs or IOs regarding humanitarian assistance or disaster response in response to a crisis? Absolutely. Our range of clients include everything from Fortune 500 companies to NGOs. In fact, one of my most memorable crisis projects was helping free a political prisoner. The political prisoner was working at an NGO in D.C. and got picked up in Iran for allegedly starting a soft revolution. And we worked online and offline, working through diplomatic efforts as well to help free her after 6 months of work. So we work with all sorts of enterprises around the world, and I will try and provide some examples throughout the webinar to discuss some of this. So one of the questions I get quite often is, really, what do we do, and how do we work with clients? Why do we work with clients? As you can see here, this picture, if any of you are familiar with the movie Jaws, this is the first time they actually see the shark, and he stands up and he doesn't even look back, doesn't even pull a cigarette out of his mouth, and he says, we're going to need a bigger boat. And oftentimes that's what we are at Edelman, is we are the bigger boat. We're there to provide arms and legs. But I think this is an important picture also on the flip side of things, that if you ever find yourself in this type of a situation, chances are you're in a crisis when you're looking for help. And help can come in a lot of different shapes and forms. But I think an interesting thing that I've spent a lot of time studying, both in my job at Edelman, but I also teach at Georgetown on this topic and spend a lot of time thinking about it, is that reputational risk, operational risk, risk in itself for businesses and organizations has evolved and changed quite a bit over the last, I would say 5 years for sure, but then in the last 12 to 24 months, we see just an explosion of dynamic nature of where risk is going. And with it, obviously, crises. And some of the things that I think about is, even the explosion of something like the Panama Papers 3 to 5 years ago, you may not have ever thought that something like the Panama Papers could expose your company, your organization, to a whole level of risk that we never even thought before. Just think about the amount of data that we have online about our clients, our customers, our employees. In fact, I know one of the recent webinars, I think from 2 or 3 months ago, was on cybersecurity, and it was really fascinating to hear those guys talk about the risks associated with this. But I mean, pose that to yourself. If you're a nonprofit and all the information about your donors gets out or leaked online, if you're a university and all of the records of your students are erased, if you're a company, all the emails from your organization are put online, not just if you're a brick and mortar retailer where, like Target or others, where there's credit card fraud. The amount of risk and the risk profiles now, because of something like the Panama Papers, has forced us to really think about, are we truly understanding what our risk profiles are? So this is one dynamic item that continues to evolve where we're going as we're thinking about what risk actually means. We're also seeing things like this. Now, apologies if you're sitting at your desk eating, but this is a picture actually that I encourage every one of my staffers to have in their cubicles or in their offices. It's a picture of pink slime, and some of you may immediately associate this with chicken McNuggets. Some of you may associate it with Taco Bell meat. The fact of the matter is, this picture is not food at all from what I understand, and I've looked into this quite extensively. This picture started floating online and immediately had a huge impact on McDonald's and Taco Bell and many others, including grocery store companies and providers of beef. But for what we can tell, this has nothing to do with any of those companies. And this picture single-handedly started an online movement that put a lot of companies, specifically one, Beef Product Inc., on its back foot. And I think within a few weeks, they had to lay off a number of employees. They had to shut down two factories, all because of an image. And that's something to think about when we're talking about risk. The threat of an image like this, a very sensational image, having a huge impact, because it's very difficult to combat it. It's even difficult to understand where it came from. But I think this, if there was a residual component to today's webinar, it's this image, where something like this, just a simple image, can go viral. It can trigger so much scrutiny in such a small amount of time, and the onslaught of online activity and interest is so difficult to navigate and challenge. In addition to that, we're seeing proactive campaigns that people should be doing, companies and organizations should be doing. This is an example of the NYPD trying to connect with their community, where they're you may be familiar with this from a year or two ago, where they're trying to engage the community, encourage people to post pictures of the NYPD's finest interacting with the community. And as one might expect, or as you might remember, this actually backfired. People started, instead of posting great pictures like what you see on your screen, They posted pictures of police brutality, police officers sleeping, doing other unsavory things, and this actually extended all the way down to Brazil and other parts of the world. And so we have to now be thinking, when we're launching programs like this in social media or just in general, what could the online response or kickback be? What's the risk associated with this? What's the user-generated content response? How could this spiral out of control? Do we need to turn the brakes on? And so certainly it's a new thing that we need to be thinking about. We're also seeing full-on campaigns be taken out on companies and organizations by interest groups and advocacy efforts. You may be familiar with the documentary Blackfish, but this was a slow-moving attack on SeaWorld and SeaWorld's alleged treatment of their orcas and their shows. And I didn't work on this, but it was a very fascinating case study to watch, where over the course of a series of months, it was clear SeaWorld wasn't taking this very seriously, but as the momentum started picking up, you could actually see the impact that this documentary and a series of online components and offline components were starting to take on the company. So much so that recently they announced that they're canceling all of their shows, which is a really interesting development, because if you've ever been to SeaWorld, the actual logo for SeaWorld is an orca, and they're changing their entire business model because of this documentary and the online campaign that was launched around that documentary. Another thing that we're seeing as kind of a trend in risk is, with technology, there also becomes technology flaws. So during the data breach of Target and many other companies during a crisis, you're going to see this flood of interest in that company or organization. And simple things like, can you sustain millions of visitors to your website? And you think about it, if you're a nonprofit and you get 6 million people visiting your site at one time, can your website stand up to that traffic? And if your site goes down, what does it suggest? Does it suggest that you have control of the situation, or does it suggest that you're folding or that you are trying to hide? So with new technology, we also have to be thinking about the challenges of what a surge of searches come following a crisis. This happened to BP, in fact, during the oil spill on the Deepwater Horizon. Their site went down for hours, and they were unable to communicate because they still weren't using social media at the time. And then finally, the other thing to think about is kind of, with the advent of mobile phones and iPads and just devices that we have and are never further than a couple of feet from us, how is this changing our human psyche and our reaction to issues? It used to be fight or flight. Now I think about it's like Instagram, Twitter, or Snapchat. You see here on your screen a New York City subway filling up with smoke, and the first thing people are doing, as you can see in the thing, is taking a picture. You saw with the terrorist potential bombing, I think this was Egypt Air, where people were taking selfies with the actual hijacker. It's just the mentality, and this started even back in 2009 with the U.S. air crash in the Hudson, that a single tweet seconds after the plane crashed actually was the thing that people were responding to, that news organizations were running. And we just have to be thinking about how fast things move now because of some of these new dynamic changes. And then the final piece of this is you're seeing conversations explode around topics that in the past would have been refined to maybe a mainstream media article. I think this is the cover. What you're seeing here is the cover of Vanity Fair magazine. I think it was Vanity Fair. And these are alleged Bill Cosby women. And one of the things that I thought was interesting in this, not just the story itself, which I think was really damning for Bill Cosby and has created some very interesting legal challenges for him and reputational pieces, obviously, is the surge of conversation, millions and millions of posts and comments just around that empty chair in the bottom right-hand corner. And so you can see how something that would be in mainstream media can now have a whole nother life of its own, and everybody has an opinion on this, whether it be their own Facebook page, Twitter, or what have you, and that creates a very significant challenge for pending litigation or other issues. You're being tried in the court of public opinion very, very fast, and the court of public law or the court of law goes very, very slow. So these are a couple things that, for me, have been really interesting in my line of work and are making things very, very dynamic in nature. And I think if you want to have one way to kind of think about it, whether you're for a for-profit company, Fortune 500, nonprofit, government organization, we work so hard about building up our reputation and establishing trust, as Warren Buffett says. But it can take 5 minutes to ruin it. I actually think it could be a tweet or a Snapchat or a video that could take a couple seconds. So if you start thinking about that, I think you're going to think about things differently. And if you put up the next question here for the group on the webinar, one of the questions I ask our clients a lot is, well, who within the organization is responsible for managing, protecting, building reputation? And I think there's a lot of confusion when I ask that, because it seems like many people look to the CEO. I think you see a lot of people look to general counsel. In my business, the chief communications officer, if you never heard of that position, many people believe that that's the person responsible. And as you can overwhelmingly see in the results here, I really do think it's everyone. Everyone has a stake in protecting, maintaining, building, and establishing a company or organization's reputation. And I think you think differently when you just even hold up a phone, knowing that people can be recording you at all times, and that holds you to a new standard. And we have to be thinking about all the different ways that risk can evolve and materialize around an enterprise. And I would actually love to take a screenshot of this and share it with some of my clients at some point, because it is actually, everyone should be thinking about reputation, and it's not just tied to an individual's job. So thank you for participating in that question. I have a couple more questions I'll throw at you here in a little bit. Now, if we can go back to the slides here, I want to take a couple minutes and walk you through a couple of things that I think are new realities that we should be thinking about within the world of risk and crisis communications or crisis management. And I think the first thing is really quite interesting. You may agree or not, but I think one of the things that social media and digital has really created is the ability for moral outrage to really create a significant challenge for organizations. Moral outrage is not anything new. Activists, critics are nothing new, but because they have the power within technology, within the talent and the ability to bring things up into the mix of social media to reach new audiences like they've never reached before, you're seeing moral outreach have a significant impact on organizations. And what I mean by that is the demand for a robust, responsible, and principles-based compliance environment. Some of this is actually really unfair for organizations to have to navigate. And what I mean by that is, if we're not being regulated by the government to do something, we need to be doing it on our own, and that's usually just good business sense. But there are times when these activists or critics are forcing us to take on responsibilities that really aren't ours. So think about the supply chain. What we've seen in the last few years is a demand for companies to maintain the understanding and control of their supply chain all the way down to the fields where cotton is picked. Are people, is the labor that's picking that cotton for T-shirts that are then sold in that store, are they treating those farmers correctly? Farming crops for companies like Chipotle, are you seeing people treated the right way? Are they using chemicals, what have you? And this idea of moral outrage is quite interesting, because sometimes those activists or critics actually get it wrong. And you saw this in India. If any of you are familiar with Maggi noodles, this is a situation where the government came out and claimed that Maggi noodles had lead in it, and it created this kind of rioting effect, and people were burning Maggi noodles on the street when it was actually incorrect. So let me take a quick pause here. Does the sound okay? We're doing okay with the sound? Are we having any challenges here? While we're trying to figure that out, one of the questions here is anyone else having issues with audio? Okay, yeah. No, it seems like a few are doing okay. But we're checking on that, so I'll do my best to speak loudly if I can. Okay. This is also, I think, being recorded, so if for some reason you can't hear me, you might be able to get this later on a replay. So that's the first new reality that I wanted to share. The second one is around this idea of digital wildfires. And You may have seen this in your own personal Facebook feed or Twitter feed, particularly around the presidential election cycle right now, where it seems like everybody is an expert on something. But what I see often is that this idea of truth is negotiated in social media constantly. And now, unfortunately, you might be saying, well, why did I use the term the idea of truth? Well, if you're a fan of Stephen Colbert, you may have seen one of his words of the week, where he said truthiness. And I often see this happen a lot in social media, where people are putting forward an argument, and it could be completely wrong, but they sound very forward and convicted in their ideas. But if you want to see and get a good gauge of a company's reputation or organization's reputation, all you have to do is go to Google or Facebook or Twitter, and very quickly, just by searching a company's name or executive's name, you can get a good sense of what their reputation is like. And I look at actually Google almost like the New York Stock Exchange of reputations. It's traded every second. And you can see here, if any of you have been to Colombia, might have enjoyed a beverage called Pony Malta. It's a non-alcoholic beverage. It's blood red. And they got into some troubles because of online rumors that somebody allegedly fell into a tank in one of their manufacturing plants, died, and then it was served. It wasn't, that it was served to the public. Now, it just happened that it turned out that when that happened, they also were having a small recall on a few batches because of the bottle top had a weird odor to it. So you add those all together, you add the rumors that you're seeing in WhatsApp and other platforms, and very quickly go to Google and or Google Colombia, and before you even finish typing in the name, you see things like Pony Malta Muerto, which if you have death associated with your brand, that's already a problem. So this whole idea of truth being negotiated and traded in real time is a really important piece of this. So one of the questions, when things are moving so fast, how do you know what even to do? Most companies choose to ignore it with no comments. And I'm actually going to get to that here in a second on some strategies to think about. But one of the things that you hit on is really important. Many companies or organizations don't even know that this is happening. So the idea that they're not monitoring in real time, that they don't understand what's going on in social media and online, that's a really important piece that is often missed. So I'm going to hit on that in a second. If you give me a couple minutes, I'll talk about some of the strategies to approach this. But if we go to the next reality here real quick, the other piece of this is, as things move so fast, a company or organization's natural reaction to address misinformation or risk or crises is to respond with facts. Here are the facts as we know them, and here's a PDF that we can put out, or here's a legal brief that proves that this is the truth. The challenge, though, is that companies and organizations aren't dealing in an environment that is rational. They're responding to an environment that is being fueled by sensationalism. And that sensationalism often trumps facts, because facts are very difficult to disclose in a 140 character tweet, or even, for that matter, if you do disclose them, people won't read them. People are going through their Facebook feed looking for things that jump out at them. A good example of this was Shell had a partnership with Lego, and Greenpeace was attacking Shell constantly for their activities and operations in the Arctic, as they were looking for more fossil fuels. And Greenpeace started attacking Lego because of this partnership, and they created this really compelling 2-3 minute video of an oil platform in the Arctic filling up with oil. It was all built out of Legos, and it was using the Lego movie song, Everything is Awesome. It was an amazing video. And it went viral very, very quickly. And if you were Lego or Shell, just think about, how do you respond to something like that? And if your organization was being criticized with an image like pink slime or this type of a video, how do you respond to something very sensational? Typically, our responses with our friends on the legal side are, we have no comment, we can't comment on pending litigation. They're very dry, corporate-y answers. We have to be thinking about where people are talking and engaging in social media and how they're doing it. So we have to be thinking differently. And then, I think the last, or the second to last new reality is that the speed is something that can really hurt us. There was a study put out by a law firm in London about that found 28% of cases or crisis issues spread internationally within an hour, which in itself isn't surprising, but the next stat actually is, on average, it takes companies and organizations about 21 hours to have a meaningful response. Think of the gap. Think of the vacuum of content that's created within 20 hours from an issue. And just the number of posts and tweets, it's so overwhelming that if you don't get into the fray, you don't respond to a situation and insert a wedge into the conversation immediately or very quickly, then you're going to be on the back foot for the rest of the issue for sure. And then the last piece of this is talking about digital mobs. They will form around any crisis or issue, and I've seen it time and time again, magnifying all the different issues as they play out. You're seeing this right now around the issue in Orlando. You're seeing it with Disney and the tragedy with the 2-year-old drowned by the alligator. You saw it with Chipotle. Countless example after countless example where there is a mob that forms online, and they are looking for more and more content, and it creates a vacuum. And if you don't fill it, then it's going to be magnified and filled by others. The first time I really saw this was during the BP oil spill. Who would have ever thought that a live feed at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico would have had hundreds of thousands of viewers? You saw engineers and mathematicians trying to calculate how much oil was flowing out of the pipe to challenge what BP and what the Coast Guard were saying. It happened, from what I understand, also that they had doctored some of these images, so it even created more of a storm of fury. But this is something we have to just understand. When a crisis occurs, there will be a vacuum, and these digital mobs will form trying to get as much information as they can. So, what does that mean? A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. I think we have to be doing a lot to be thinking about how do we respond, how do we prepare ourselves to navigate an issue. And if you put the next question on, I'll challenge it to you, to the viewers on the webinar. Do you feel like your organization is adequately prepared to manage a crisis effectively? And this is one of the first questions we ask our clients when we come in of, do you have the right pieces in place? Responding to an issue is very, very important, but much like an elite athlete trains countlessly to build muscle memory in their sport of choice, we as within organizations, businesses, we should be doing the same thing. We should be training. We should be thinking about when we see a competitor go through an issue, how do we respond? How do we react? Because I think most rational people will be more interested in how a company or organization reacts and responds to an issue rather than the issue itself. That's just what I've seen. Now, there can be, to be very clear, if you do something really, really bad, you're going to have to do something really, really good to redeem yourself, and you can't PR or spin your way out of an issue. You can't crisis communicate yourself out of an issue. You actually will have to take meaningful changes to your organization to have a meaningful response. But I think the most important piece of this is to build and establish an organization that understands reputational risk, that understands how they should react and respond to it, and it's based off of principles, and it's based off of training and implementation of those principles. So it looks like right here the response is most people don't think that their organization is adequately prepared, and I think you're probably in good company. For the 9 of you who said yes, that's great. Kudos to those organizations. But I do think that we can constantly be working on thinking about how do we bolster preparedness. And the remainder of the webinar will be walking you through a couple of best practice steps to think about managing operational readiness and reputational readiness. So if we go back to the slides here, and feel free to keep chiming in with questions. We'll have 10 or 15 minutes at the end to also address some of these questions as they pop up as well. So the first imperative for preparedness, in my view, is this idea of if you fail to prepare, then prepare to fail. I think you've heard that many times by much more famous people than I on this webinar, for sure. But I think we need to be thinking about establishing processes and governance during good times rather than waiting for tricky or critical times to navigate structures within our enterprises. This goes for large organizations for sure, but it also goes down to small, 3 or 4 people businesses or enterprises. Who makes the call? Who's responsible for navigating issues in social media? Who's responsible for working with employees? Who's responsible? You can go across your enterprise and start thinking about all the different audiences that need to be communicated to, and who's responsible for it, who's managing it, who's monitoring it. I don't think that we should approach social media, digital crisis management as the Wild West. In fact, I think you can be building good processes and structures, or as I call them, guardrails, that give you an understanding of what you can do. And the benefit of doing this is if you do it right, you can effectively start to remove some of the emotion that comes with a crisis situation. Now, you're not going to get rid of all of it, but you can have it by having process. People feel more comfortable. They understand what their role and responsibility is, and those guardrails help you make decisions, and they help you do it in a much more effective way. At the very least, it may even guide you into calling someone like myself or lawyers or other third-party experts who can provide a little bit of a non-biased approach or view to how you might navigate those issues. So that's the first piece, is making sure you really have a process in place to establish governance and give people that safety net of, okay, here are the first 3 things we do when X, Y, or Z happens. Here are the people we call. If you don't have that and you find yourself in a crisis, it's very difficult to set some time apart and start building that process. One of the components to this is even understanding, are you in a crisis or not? And that seems kind of silly for a couple reasons. One is many people think that the definition of crisis is pretty straightforward. But I think when you get into each of your various organizations or businesses, it can be very tricky of determining what is a crisis and what's not. And what I want to kind of diagnose with that or pull apart is, if you don't have a definition for a crisis, you could be creating more work for yourself, and you're creating an internal crisis just by reacting to an external issue. I don't know how many of you have been in this situation where you might get a phone call from the CEO who's freaking out because of a Google alert. But I receive a lot of those. So you make this Google alert go away. Well, that's not a crisis, but by the CEO responding to it and activating 12 people, it becomes a crisis very quickly. So a couple of the things that we look at is, how do you understand what the definition of a crisis is? What are the drivers of severity? And here are a couple of different things that we look at. The organizational purpose, how fast are things spreading online or within mainstream media, within regulators, the momentum and influence of the people that are involved, the terrain that you're seeing that you're currently in right now, what type of advocacy potential are there in terms of, are you seeing a lot of activists pop up and try and drive new change? And then, what's your current status of trust and relationships? So these are all things that we start encouraging our clients to really think about as they're taking that first step to define what a crisis is. A good question in here, when the slides are shared, will we have permission to share them? Yeah, for sure. If you would like to use them, I would just encourage you, if you do use them, not to use them for any commercial purposes unless you email me, and be happy to chat about that. The second thing to think about in terms of establishing preparedness is back to the point about monitoring. Now, monitoring, I think, can get downplayed quite a bit. Is it just having Google alerts set up? Is it just reading newspapers and seeing what's happening in social media? Part of it is, yes, for sure. But I think a big piece of this is creating or gathering intelligence from what you're seeing online and what you're seeing in the media. And what I mean by that is not just the data, but the intelligence that's allowing you to inform strategy. Here's a good example. We were dealing with an issue a couple of years ago. It was a safety-related issue, an explosion. And the company in question was doing the right thing. They were putting together a press conference. They were putting out materials, and they were going to put forward an expert, a safety expert, to make sure that everyone had their time to have questions answered and to feel better about the situation and the response. Now, the challenge was they weren't really monitoring beyond kind of the actual issue itself. We found out about this press conference. We weren't actually planning it, and we started asking a lot of questions. And one of the questions we asked is, well, who's speaking to the media? Turns out that the safety expert, and he really was an expert, who was going to speak to the media, if you did a Google search for him, the first thing that popped up was a mugshot. And the mugshot was from a DUI arrest. Actually, the charges were dropped. It wasn't a huge deal. But if you think about it, if you're a member of the media, you're a member of the community, you're really worried about flames coming out of an issue in your community and a safety-related issue, you'll have some natural surprise when the person who's speaking about safety has this type of a mugshot. And so we need to be digging below just the volume of posts. We need to actually be making sense of what's happening so that we're not operating in the dark, that we are using the enormous amounts of data to inform our strategy and to guide us as we move forward. So that's a really important piece to be thinking about. The third imperative for preparedness is to think about that idea of the factual record. So earlier when I was talking about realities and talking about the vacuum, we need to be thinking about how are we defining the issue? How are we using all the different tools at our disposal, online, offline, partnerships, relationships? What are we doing to at least own the factual record? Planting a flag in the sand, so to speak, a beachhead, so that this idea is if you aren't doing anything, if you're not taking those steps to define the factual record, then you're leaving it up for other people. You're leaving it up for Google. You're leaving it up for Facebook. And a good example of this is, you may have seen this over the last couple of years with Heineken. They were navigating an issue around dogfighting rumors in Mongolia, of all places. Apparently it's legal to do dogfighting in Mongolia, but this is a case study that I studied where they were responding to this issue, and because of the online mob mentality, it kept popping up month after month after month. And one of the things that they eventually did that allowed them to navigate this issue in much more meaningful pace was to find the record, to basically say, here's what's been happening around this rumor. Here's what we've done. We've never sponsored dogfighting. As you can see here, this is how it played out. And they did it in a really simple infographic that was shareable, as you can see on your screen. Beforehand, they were just responding with very kind of dry copy on their website that was a little bit difficult to find. But once they started doing this, I think they were moving much further along in responding to the issue and managing the issue. Key imperative number 4 is to be transparent and to, in as many different channels as you possibly can, to show your work, not just talk the talk, but actually walk the walk, if you will. And if you go back to the pink slime issue, one of the things that McDonald's did, which I thought was very clever, because they were seeing significant impact in sales around this issue, was to go actually behind the scenes and to show how chicken McNuggets were made. And so they had a spokesperson go to one of their plants and invite viewers in through a video and answer the question, is this pink goop in chicken McNuggets? And you could very clearly see from the video that absolutely not, at point in the process making chicken McNuggets did you actually see pink slime. And it allowed them to be as transparent as they could. It allowed them to go into the channels like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, where this image and various other images were being spread. And I think the image that they were showing was much more impactful and much more credible than any statement that they could put out. And I think they got a lot of goodwill, and I think that media was very responsive to this approach. So that's something you have to be thinking about, is showing and being transparent in your response when you're navigating issues and preparing for that in advance. How much are you willing to share? How much are you revealing about your processes in advance? Key imperative number 5. This is something that I call converting PhD to ADD. I think we are often, as I had mentioned before, responding with facts that are very boring, very dry, that aren't social by design. And what I mean by that, they're not statements that people would inherently share. We need to be thinking about how our company, how our organization or enterprise can respond in social channels and in digitally, where people would actually want to look at it, and they would want to share it, and they want to push it around. And a good example of this is, that you may have seen this story. There was a New York Times op-ed that, I think it was an op-ed or a story that really criticized Walmart for some of their activities. Now, I think, the normal response from a company would be put out a statement or respond with your own op-ed that maybe a small portion of people would read. In this case, they actually printed out the full story, and then they marked it up, much like a professor would do at a university. And you can see here, thanks for sharing your first draft. Below are a few thoughts to ensure something inaccurate doesn't get published. Hope this helps, Walmart. It was very cheeky, kind of fun. I don't think any other organization could probably do this again. But facts matter. But sometimes it's difficult to believe that that's actually the case online. And we need to be converting our messages into an environment that has a difficult time focusing and paying attention. In fact, I don't know about you, but most people in Facebook watch videos without actually listening to the audio because they're maybe laying there in bed and their significant other is sleeping. I was doing it last night as I was flipping through. And so it does your video in the first 20 seconds if you're responding in Facebook actually tell a story without the audio. So how are we breaking through the online noise and demanding attention in a way that allows us to then share our message points? And I think this response was really quite good. So convert the PhD to ADD. And if you have challenges with your legal team or your communications or marketing folks and doing it, it takes a lot of time and practice and energy to be able to do this effectively. Number 6 is to be thinking about how do you cut through the noise online. Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and others have these paid algorithms that are making it more and more difficult every day to cut through the noise unless you are buying ads, unless you are amplifying it through paid services. And so if you may have seen the movie Field of Dreams from decades ago. If you build it, they will come. And he says it multiple times. If you build it, they will come. If you put something online, it doesn't mean people are going to see it. In fact, it's a big challenge for people to see it. So we need to be amplifying. And the cool thing about online ads now within Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, on websites is that we can target audiences. We can buy our way into conversations. We can micro-target so that we're reaching the people who are really interested in an issue. And we can be doing it in a way that's not as intrusive as just a shotgun shot, where somebody who may not be familiar with an issue then becomes aware of it because of an ad. We can actually go and find people online who already are aware of an issue by their behavior and serve them up with content that allows them to see your response. You saw this recently with the NFL responding to concussions and an NFL or a New York Times story that they believed was wrong, and that they needed to make sure that people who were following the story, who are interested in football, got their response. And this was actually, what you're seeing here is a Twitter ad that I received with their response. I actually wasn't aware of the story by the time I saw this, but I clicked on this, read their response, and then read the story, and I actually read it from the NFL's perspective first, which I think was a win for the NFL. I can't remember if I agreed with them or not, but it was an interesting way to be brought into the storyline. So that's a very important piece to this, is if you build it, they will not come. You have to be bringing them to the story, to the content, to the information. Number 7, influencers are totally different. And what I mean by an influencer is the people who are driving conversation, driving opinions. You used to be Walter Cronkite would sign off every night. That's the way it is, and that's the way it was. He was like our dad, and you didn't question it. A lot has changed. We now question the media as much as we're questioning things online. But you're also seeing this rise of new influencers. I don't know if you're familiar with this woman, Rosanna Pacino, but she has 4.8 million followers on YouTube. When she says something on her show, people listen. She made $2.5 million last year because of her show. You're seeing the rise of new channels like Business Insider, BuzzFeed, Reddit, Huffington Post. And so we have to be thinking about all the different relationships we have and activating them, because influencers are totally different than they were a couple years ago. We have to be going beyond just normal media channels. We have to be thinking about these influencers and what that means. So if you aren't in the communications or marketing business, you do sales, then think about who are your biggest customer advocates. Are you reaching out to them during a crisis and making sure that they understand directly from you what your response is, or are you relying on somebody else to convey that message? If you're in internal communications or you work with employees, are you remembering to communicate to your employees? if you aren't telling them the facts, you're not providing them with information, then they could be at a cocktail party, a barbecue, picking up kids at school, and they're going to get the question when somebody knows that they work at that company or that organization. So give them resources. They want to help you. They want to believe in their company or organization. So we have to be thinking differently about influencers. Number 8, kind of continue on that same line, stakeholders hate surprises. So as you are responding to an issue, don't just go straight to the media. Don't just go straight to the government. Think about communicating inside out before you go to the media. And sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes you're in a regulated industry or you're a publicly traded company, and if it's material, you have to communicate at the same time. But this is actually a snapshot from Penn State. If you ever use Google Trends, one of the interesting things you can look at with Google Trends is where people are searching for information. And so I was playing around this issue when all the stuff with Penn State was happening around the Sandusky trial, and you can clearly see here from Google Trends that people within 5 miles of State College are the ones driving the search activity. And so what that suggests to me is they probably needed to communicate to their employees, to their faculty, staff, and students as much, if not more so, than to the ESPNs, USA Todays of the world. And that's something that's really important, and data will push you on this and really, I think, confirm this if that's your instinct, is don't forget about employees, don't forget about communicating inside out and your main stakeholders. We often forget them, particularly in the worst times. The second to last imperative, bear with me, I'm almost done. You're judged by the company that you keep, and so continue on this line of stakeholders. Sometimes it's better for others to speak on your behalf. You may have seen this situation with Anna Kournikova where she was responding to issues about doping. She was out there by herself. There were a lot of people who had different opinions on how well she did, but it's very interesting to see a tennis player try and talk credibly about doping. It might have been more interesting to see a doctor or a nutritionist or some kind of scientist to be right there beside her and say, we've been looking at the data, we've been working with Anna, we've been helping her navigate this. This is clearly a mistake. We have a team of experts constantly looking at this. But instead, you only heard it from her. Now, again, everyone kind of has their own opinion on this. I'm sorry, Maria Sharapova. Thank you very much. Thank you. See, the internet always sets you free. The truth is not negotiated, I guess, sometimes. But I think this is something to really kind of think about as you are going through an issue. Who can speak on your behalf? Who are your friends who carry a lot of credibility and can help you with your reputation? And then the last piece of this is no scenario is too far-fetched. Plan and train and test for worst case scenarios as much as you're doing them for normal issues that might pop up. So for example, Sony could have never thought that when their employees came to work that day, that when they turned on their computers that they would have seen an image like this on their computer screen, that they would have had to completely disconnect the internet for the entire company as they navigated the issue around their hack. But this is a really good lesson. We need to be thinking about what are all the worst case scenarios? Where are the risks that we need to be thinking about? And having a training, having a test, planning against those risks that are most likely, but also could have the biggest impact. And it could be the simplest way to do this, I think, is most companies and organizations have regular staff meetings on a weekly basis. So maybe take 5 or 10 minutes each week or every other week to have a crisis-related topic. If we're seeing X, Y, and Z happen to a competitor or another organization, what would we do if it happened to us? What are the first 3 things we would do? What are the things we're worried most about? Do we need to do more to plan against that? And again, it can be in any job responsibility, any job function. Think about the risks that you could be faced, and then do some training, do some testing, at least explore it and talk about it on a regular basis. So one of the questions from Joe for crisis teams, how do you assign and manage the battle against disinformation? It's a really good question. I think one of the things that we do constantly is attack misinformation as much as we can when it's being driven by somebody of influence. And what I mean by that is if somebody with only 3 followers or who's not influential posts something online that's not correct, you may actually attract more attention to it if you attack it or you try and correct it. There's a phenomenon for this. It's called the Streisand effect. All you have to do is look it up on Wikipedia or online. She was dealing with an issue where she was trying to keep paparazzi from taking pictures of her house, and by sending cease and desist orders, she actually made more people take pictures of her house. And you've recently seen this with Axl Rose. They call it Fat Axl. When he was a little overweight and going back on tour again, he was trying to squash pictures of himself online, and more people saw it. So we have to really, we look at who's posting stuff online, what's their influence, what's their reach, and is it worth reaching out to them and engaging them? And that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is obviously similar to the Heineken situation, is just establishing your own record, so that if an issue does pop up, you already have a place online where you can point people to, or you've been talking to people offline and trying to manage that information. So that's a really good question, Joe. Starts with monitoring so that you catch those issues before they become full-on crises, for sure. Another question from Zoe. Sure, we can say all employees own their company's reputation, but which departments do you see ultimately owning and guiding reputation management efforts? That's a great, very good question. I think in my line of work, I often see the communications function pushing this, because we're often tasked with going out and either selling the mission, trying to get good coverage of a company or organization, positioning executives publicly. And so we're often very close to managing and sculpting what the reputation looks like. So operationally, I see the communications department often kind of driving that, but it doesn't mean that the marketing group or legal or others. I think legal is often tasked with managing legal risk, and they're often very, very closely connected with communications. But those are the two groups that I often see driving it. Just to give you an example, from a communications side of things, we're often working with communications and PR colleagues at in-house at companies and organizations to do drills, to train executives on how to respond to tough questions. We often even work with security guards at the front desk. So if camera crews show up or protesters, how not to get themselves into trouble, how do they escalate it, how do they manage that in a way that's smart. We've done coaching of customer service lines. We've worked with social media managers, sales forces. So there's a lot of different things that we get our hands and fingers into, but that's typically who I see kind of owning it on a regular basis. A couple other questions starting to come in here. Let's see.
While they're typing, and perhaps this is one of the slides, Dan, but when you and I were talking earlier, you mentioned the 4 R's.
Yes.
Which I think is kind of interesting to share, because it sort of wraps it up nicely in a bow, I think.
Yeah, the 4 R's are often used by a lot of different organizations, and what we think about that is the journey that an organization and or its stakeholders go through a crisis. And the first one is usually the most difficult. The first one is regret. Do you express regret? Are you showing a human emotion? You may not be accepting liability of the situation, but you're accepting responsibility that there's been a negative issue. I think this is going to be really interesting to see how that plays out with Disney. Are they accepting responsibility of this horrible situation within one of their properties? And the key is to get through these R's to restitution, which is the far other one, where you are actually providing a solution and moving forward. But I think regret is the biggest one that many organizations really get trapped in, where they just don't know what to say. And this is a good exercise for you. Look at any crisis situation and see the company response, and you can kind of see a template that forms, and whether it's being driven by legal or whether it's being driven by their principles. Now, they're not mutually exclusive, but you often see, we regret this situation, and it seems very dry. But I think the more you can add some human emotion for things that are very difficult, it doesn't mean you're accepting liability, but you're certainly accepting responsibility to find a solution and move on for it.
So it's regret. And restitution is the last.
Yeah, I'm now suddenly remorse is, yeah, I mean, remorse is part of that, and then actually showing repair and repairing the steps that you're going through. Yeah, thank you for jogging my memory on it. But these, you know, it's very interesting to see how companies and organizations are reacting and responding to those things. But you know, I think again the biggest one is the regret piece of this that we get stuck on. A couple more questions here. So from Aaron, in situations where you're really legally restricted, how can you still respond without really responding? You know, you see this quite a bit by law enforcement during a situation like Orlando shooting or the Boston Marathon or others, where you can basically say, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and here's what we're doing to move forward and try and fix this. And I think that is a careful box that you can stay within, and it's a series of message points that you can stick within and feel pretty safe about it. But I think that is a tricky situation, and I think the lawyers are there to help you. They're there to help you not get into more trouble. But I think there are times when you need to kind of look at them and say, well, you know, I'm willing to take on that additional legal risk in order to move things along if needed. But typically I would stick to, you know, here's the box of things that I understand, here are the things that we don't understand yet, and here's where we're moving forward. And you can see that kind of method and approach used in many different crisis situations. Just look at testimony in front of Congress. A lot of times that's what you'll see companies and organizations of how they respond. You haven't mentioned, this is from Tom, you haven't mentioned police much. Do you assist them directly given the past 2 years of increased scrutiny? You know, I think that's a really good question, Tom. We have worked with law enforcement and actual, you know, Coast Guard and other authorities when navigating issues. But yes, a lot of times we would just assist those entities with their investigation by being as forthcoming as possible and partnering as best as we possibly can. And it's very important, I think, to work with them up to a point. Now, you know, the thing that you should know, like in a data breach, the FBI and Secret Service really don't care about you as an organization. They want to get the bad guys, which I totally agree with. But, you know, you need to mind your shop. You need to mind your customers and employees. So you should work with them as much as you can, but also realize that at the end of the day, they're not there to help you. They're there to get the bad guys, which I think is a really important piece to as you navigate this. So Christine, not sure how to phrase this. If someone is setting up a one-person shop and knows they can't afford a team to keep an eye on reputation, do you have recommendations for baseline, what they should be watching for, preparing for? Yeah, I think the things I would think about are monitoring first. Are you, even if by yourself, are you having alerts sent to you about your company name, about yourself, so that you understand how people are reacting? Are you looking at Yelp reviews and Google reviews and staying on those things? And then the next piece of preparedness is just knowing what you would do if X, Y, or Z happens. So who would you call? Is there a lawyer friend that you have? Is there someone who does PR that you have that you could at least get on the phone for 5 minutes or 10 minutes and ask for their opinion, particularly for solo operators or one-person shops, really making sure that you understand who your friends are and who you can tap into as needed. I have friends all over the place, one who's a lawyer, and whenever I have a challenge that I want to get some thoughts on, he'll listen to me for a couple minutes and give me his reactions, which I think is really helpful for me both personally and professionally, and I would encourage you to do that. So that's where I would spend my time immediately if you have limited resources. From New, what do you think the lesson learned from BP ex-CEO? He tried to do all he could, then everything backfired on him. Yeah, I was just talking about this to someone the other day. I mean, it was a horrible situation. Exxon Valdez level spill for 40 days and 40 nights. Just horrible. I think the thing that he could have done better from the very beginning was just be more human. And think about it. Here's a guy who was in finance, engineer, from London coming over to the Gulf of Mexico, and all people wanted to know was what's happening, what are you doing to fix it, and to hear and feel some human emotion. And I think that's a big thing that we often lose sight of in a crisis, is we get so focused on those, back to the regret piece of this. And I think that's where he probably could have done better. And the other thing is, he probably wasn't the best spokesperson. So you don't need the CEO all the time to be the spokesperson. It probably would have been better to have someone who sounded a lot like the folks who are around the Gulf of Mexico navigating that issue. The CEO, Tony, should have definitely been there like he was, but maybe he shouldn't have been the face of that crisis going forward. A lot of interesting lessons, obviously, from the BP spill. And then do we have time for one more?
Take the last one. Yep.
Okay, Christy, what are the top 5 digital media stream to traditional companies should be comfortable navigating or able to engage with? So I'm assuming that's like channels. It really depends, Christy, on who your audience is, who your stakeholders. If your audience is in Facebook, then you need to be in Facebook, and you need to be thinking about Facebook. If they're a younger group, you need to be thinking about Snapchat and Yik Yak and all. That's what universities now are thinking about. But it really depends on your audience. I wouldn't be in a channel just for being in the sake of the channel, because I think it will create a lot of additional risk if you aren't navigating it properly. But look at what your audiences are doing, and that's where I think I would be.
Dan, thank you so much for a fascinating conversation. As I said, I heard you speak before, and it's just such an interesting topic, and I know that we are going to get you back here to talk to our students some more, but thank you today for talking to your fellow alumni, and thank you to all of you who attended. We appreciate it, and of course to Mike and Karen behind the scenes, thank you for making this happen. We'll see you in a couple of months on the next webinar, I think is on ethics. So thank you so much. Take care.